Episode number 5 of the Severe Setup is in your ears. It's on your eyes. We are here. We're going to get you set up for this weekend. We're going to talk some fights. We're going to talk maybe a little bit of a topic towards the end of the podcast about maybe the upcoming TV deal that the UFC will have going on at the end of this year and some of the ins and outs. I think that's going to be a big talking point as this year progresses and as negotiations start, which should be in around the summertime if we're going off the last deal. But let's focus our attention on another UFC Apex card that's happening this weekend in Las Vegas, Nevada, and another middleweight fight, Harry, at the top of the bill. What did we do to deserve this travesty? 2 middleweight fights in the Apex 2 weekends in a row. What the fuck is going on here, man?
I know. I mean, look. I probably should have had a really poignant and interesting point to say there, but Joe Pyfer and Jack Hermansson. I mean, okay. Jack Hermansson is colloquially and for a long time has just been a very interesting fighter. He's probably needed that little bit of rounding, needed that little bit of seasoning, needed that little bit of time to sort of bring himself up to that sort of really nice equilibrium level where skills and experience and maturity all seem to match and mold. And I think, at least from what I'm reading and what I'm hearing of Jack Hermansson, specifically Spencer's articles with Jack Hermansson, what you get a feeling of is just that he is managed to traverse the fight game and has now got to a position where he doesn't need the belt. He doesn't need the title fights. He doesn't need whatever. He's doing this now to prove to himself that the work he puts in at the gym and the level that he has in the gym is actually the level he is when he goes out and competes. And that's a really, really interesting place for a fighter to be, because not only do you have the sort of mental clarity and the calm that comes along with a situation like that, there's also the other side, which is, well, if you don't need the title, if you don't need sort of that adoration, that validity, right? Is there a piece missing? Because you look at somebody like Joe Pyfer, who's exactly the opposite. Young, hungry in terms of MMA, surging, massive lunchbox hands. He's looking to push that story and push who he is. And he doesn't have the same level as sort of calm, I guess, or humility, I guess, that you see in a guy of Jack Hermansson. And so from just a pure character perspective, it's a really, really interesting main event. And again, on paper, quite an interesting grappling perspective that we have going on.
100%. You talked about Jack Hermansson, his character, his personality, and his opponent, Joe Pyfer, is coming in there for his first main event inside the UFC. Also an interesting character, fantastic story, had a tough upbringing, had a tough run of it on Dana White's Contender Series. In his first appearance, broke his arm, had to fight back from that to get into the position where he's at right now. And I've been enjoying his rise up through the middleweight division, and we've come to a kind of a point with Joe Pyfer, and I do believe with Jack Hermansson in this main event too, is that it's going to give us a good idea where both these guys are at currently in their career. Obviously, Pyfer, a guy on the rise, Hermansson, a guy, like I said, not going to be looking to go for title shots, probably won't go for title shots, but a guy that's wanting to bounce back from that Roman Dolidze loss. A fighter that I don't think we have seen his true capabilities in these last couple of fights. I think this is a good fight for him to kind of prove he still belongs, because it's a slippery slope for Jack Hermansson in this one, Harry. He wins, he makes a run again at maybe the top 5. He loses, he's kind of in a position where he's this gatekeeper for the top 10, top 15 in the middleweight division. And unfortunately for him, you're likely going to have, if he loses against Joe Pyfer, the likes of the Bo Nichols coming along, the other upcoming middleweight fighters that UFC will produce coming along, which is not really too much right now.
One guy, and then he's like, and
I struggle immediately. I think that tells the story of the middleweight division, but the next coming hungry guy in the middleweight division, whoever that may be, is yet to emerge.
Born, I reckon.
What?
Yet to be born, I reckon.
Yeah, maybe being born. He'd be straight out of the room and in to take Jack Hermansson on the UFC Apex card here. But yeah, look at big fight here in terms of where both these guys are at. Like on paper, doesn't really, bolster the imagination, doesn't really get you too excited. But there's a lot on the line for both of these guys. And for that reason alone, it genuinely has me invested in this fight. And I'm curious to see how it plays out when both these guys do eventually. Maybe if you want to unpack what I said and go into maybe a little bit of analysis on what both of these guys should be doing inside in the octagon on Saturday night.
Sure. So I think I completely agree with the points on the character, and I can't say I'm as invested, but I like both of them as characters, and I think that is something that we get maybe a little bit more rarely in the UFC these days, where you are both invested from a pure fight perspective, but you're also invested in the characters. Like both men, Joe Pyfer, obviously, we've heard of his story and the twists and turns that his life has taken to get him here. But Jack Hermansson just genuinely seems like a good dude, like a nice dude, a good, well-rounded man. And those are the men generally that don't speak the loudest in the UFC, and they don't, get some of the recognition that they deserve. Obviously, we have seen what some men in the middleweight division will do for attention. And sure, look, these things happen in MMA, but when we get a fight where you are invested in both character and fight, I think that's something just a little bit special, And so I think I'm a little bit more invested in the characters than I am in the specific fight. But obviously, we'll watch it, we'll have fun, everything will be grand. Specifically in terms of what we should be looking for, Jack Hermansson sets up his takedowns in a very, very specific fashion. They're very what's the best way to? They're very strict in the way he sets them up, right? He loves a big blast double. He's happy with some clinch work, but he's one of the few wrestlers, specifically in the middleweight division, that will actually shoot in open space and will happily take you down in open space. Whereas with other fighters, they will run you to the cage and then look for cage wrestling sequences. Jack Hermansson will happily take you down in the middle of the cage and work from there. And so that for Joe Pyfer is absolutely something he's going to need to look for on his P's and Q's. If he feels that shots are coming and he's starting to have range breached, he doesn't want to just start circling off, because Jack Hermansson will shoot, right? It's not going to be the same that he's going to be afforded the luxury to have his hips breached and then run all the way back to the cage and start fighting from there. He's going to need to have a down blocking hand early. He's going to need to have his hips light and ready to sprawl at all times. For Joe Pyfer, I think because of the strict nature of Jack Hermansson's shooting, it also sometimes can be easy to read because the setups are often the same. And so if I'm Joe Pyfer, I'm looking to, as we said with Roman Dolidze last week, we are looking to attack the legs. We are looking to try and break down that Jack Hermansson rhythm as much as possible. We are looking to try to force reactions out of Jack Hermansson that either show when the takedown is coming, show when that big overhand right is coming, or start to set up some of the big left hooks that we know that Joe Pyfer has. And so I think for both men, I'm very interested, as I sound like a broken fucking record at this point, but I'm really interested in the range battle specifically. Yeah. Who wins the range battle? Because if Joe Pyfer wins the range battle, it's more likely that he stuffs the takedowns that come from Jack Hermansson. If Jack Hermansson wins the range battle, it's more likely that we see Joe Pyfer have to use his get-up game and start to find a way to get back to his feet.
Two final questions before we move on to the co-main event, Harry. Pyfer was in there, got the arm triangle choke win over Abdul Razak Al-Hassan in his last fight. Big step up in competition against Jack Hermansson. And also, this is a 5-round fight as well. We have not seen Joe Pyfer go to a decision since his second professional fight. And that was only 3 5-minute rounds. We're going for 5 5-minute rounds. Ever since going for that decision, he's won and lost. The longest he's gone is into the second round. And, maybe it was the longest apart from that decision was against Abdul Razak Al-Hassan. You're Jack Hermansson here. You're going to want to bring Pyfer into deep waters, aren't you?
You are. If you're Jack Hermansson, one of the things that you're looking to use is that veteran savvy. You've been there, you've done it, you've kind of seen it all at this point in Jack Hermansson's career. And so for Joe Pyfer, as you've said, he's a finisher. He's somebody that starts quick and ends quick, right? Frankly. this is the first. I wonder whether and I don't want to make too many correlations back to the Nassourdine Imavov versus Dolidze fight, but I wonder whether we see an element here where Joe Pyfer has to dial his style back a little bit, because there isn't a potential of 15 minutes of fighting. There's a potential of 25 minutes of fighting, and that is a significant difference. And I wonder whether that changes the metric with which Joe Pyfer starts to apply the gas tank and starts to look for those big shots. Because if it does, and he starts to fight a little bit slower, then the ability for Hermansson who we know can put the foot on the gas for 5 hard rounds, the ability for him to start to edge into his own rhythms here starts to rise dramatically. We could also see that Joe Pyfer just finishes fights early, but has the ability to go 5-minute rounds. And I think that's where some of my intrigue also lies, right?
Absolutely. And like on a normal circumstance, I would say, after going in there against Razak Al Hassan, it might be too big of a step up, but Joe Pyfer is 27 and he's going to be able to recover if he does go out there and lose this fight as well. So, a good kind of testing point, a good testing fight for Joe Pyfer. And we'll see what happens to that. Co-main event, 2 Hawaiian warriors will go to war, Harry. Dan Ige, Andre Fili, 3-round in the 145-pound division. Before we get into that fight, I think we've got to spare a thought for Lerone Murphy, who was supposed to take this come-in event slot, got injured again. Probably one of the most unluckiest guys in mixed martial arts, Harry, isn't he?
I'd say so, but I think there is an element, and maybe I'm talking out of turn here. And so if I am, and if I'm going a bit wild, then please tell me. But it feels as though for somebody like Lerone Murphy, who just consistently is getting injured, that tells me something about either where his body is right now in his career, or the way that he's training, or the way that he's then looking after his body, right? Like, we know with somebody like the aforementioned Paul Hughes, he broke his hand in a fight early in his career. And that hand has plagued him and plagued him and plagued him and plagued him for the sort of almost the rest of his career. Now, there's been other injuries, right? He's had back problems and this and that and the next thing. But I think when you have a recurring injury like that, that can absolutely just be misfortune. Because you go into the fight and you can't just hold back and say, look, I'm only going to hit your man with 25% just in case my hand hurts. Fuck that. You've got to go and absolutely smack him, right? And so if your if your hand breaks in a fight, these things happen in MMA. But for Lerone Murphy, it seems as though there are lots of different injuries happening as soon as camp really starts to build up a steam. And that, I think, tells us a little bit of something.
Yeah, a very good assessment. I didn't even think about it that way at all. And, time is not on Lerone Murphy's side now. And this was a good opportunity for him against a good guy in Dan Ige. Andre Fili is the guy who's come in and replaced him at short notice. What do you think about this fight? This is going to be a banger, really, isn't it?
So I love the fight in terms of I really like both fighters, and I also really like both fighters' styles. But this is a horrific styles matchup for Andre Fili. An absolutely horrific styles matchup. Andre Fili likes to throw ones, throws twos, throws threes. He likes to fight long. He likes to fight on the outside. He can do a bit of the grappling. Not the biggest hitter. Can absolutely finish guys, but not the biggest hitter. But also isn't the quickest starter. Dan Ige can sprint for 15 minutes. And when he starts sprinting, it's very, very hard to slow him down unless you are a massive hitter or a really phenomenal grappler. And unfortunately, Andre Fili is neither of those things. And sometimes when he gets hit and clipped, Andre Fili can sometimes struggle to get back to the rhythm that he starts to build. I think Dan Ige has a really good ability at finding inside space and landing big hooks. That's a problem for somebody like Andre Fili who fights a little bit longer. It will be a fantastic fight, I suspect.
Yeah, plenty of excitement. I think if you're Fili here, you've got to do something to try and negate the jab of Dan Ige. It's his money shot. It's what he builds all of his attacks off of. What can you do when you're dealing with a guy that has such a jab like Dan Ige?
I mean, variety is the spice of life, you know?
Love
Like,
it.
if I'm Andre Fili, he has some nice leg kicks, and we want to time those leg kicks at the same time as Dan Ige is breaking into space. We cannot allow to throw naked leg kicks and get countered by jabs. We need to make sure that we're keeping our head off the center line as much as possible to negate the jab. We need to have a cultured jab of our own. We need to make sure that we're mixing up some strikes to the body so that the jab has something to think about rather than just going out in and around at will. And equally, we need stance switches. If we're staying in southpaw or staying in orthodox, Dan Ige is going to be able to start timing some of your footwork patterns and some of your movements. So constantly switching stances. Have a little bit of the Dustin Poiriers where we're switch fighting or switch striking, as we call it, where you're moving through stances as you're throwing combinations. You're just going to have to give lots and lots and lots of different looks here. Otherwise, Dan Ige will be on the front foot and he'll be finding the inside space and he'll be landing big shots. And that's a problem.
But boom, that is a problem. Won't be a problem for us watching along. I'm expecting that one to be a decent fight. And, you know, will I put the hex on it, Harry? I'd be surprised if we see all 3 rounds in that one. So, you know, we're heading for a decision in that fight in the co-main event. Dan Ige, Andre Fili. Moving down a little bit on the card, on the main card, we also have your guy Brad Tavares versus Gregory Robocop Rodrigues. You highlighted this fight. You're a big Brad Tavares fan, aren't you, Harry? You like Brad Tavares. You like the cut of his jib, as they like to say.
I do. I like both of these fighters, actually. I think Gregory Rodrigues is just a mad bastard all around. And I think for Brad Tavares, he's just that workman-like style where he's pretty good at everything. He's just not great at anything. And that is that level of well-roundedness, or that ability to be this well-rounded and to have this longevity in the UFC, means something, right? He's been a gatekeeper for a long time. He's been a litmus test for a long time. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. And I think really what they're doing with Gregory Rodrigues is giving him a backstep, giving him somebody that in his last couple of performances has taken big shots and has been finished, or has shown that he has an ability now to be finished later in his career. And they're giving Rodrigues somebody that they expect to go out and do that in the same vein. But Brad Tavares I just really like him. He's got a bit of the Kelvin Gastelums about him, in that on his day he's really, really good and he can fight kind of everywhere. But on not so much of his day, he just gets blammed and he can't find himself out of angles and he can't find himself out of sort of second or third gear. And so for that reason alone, I think this is going to be a really fun fight. I like both styles. I think they meld really, really well. Both of them hit hard. Brad Tavares got a wicked left high kick, and Gregory Rodrigues, as I said before, is just a bit of a mad bastard all round. You know, he was fighting with literally a hole in his skull and was like, sure, be grand. We'll just carry on doing the things. And sign me up for a fella that can do that, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. 2 warriors. Obviously Rodrigues coming off of a first round win over Dennis Tululin. We have seen Brad Tavares in their last against Chris Weidman getting unanimous decision win. Be interesting to see how both of those guys will kind of square up on Saturday night. Let's have a brief look at the rest of the card. I'll just run through a couple of other fights. Rodolfo Vieira versus Armin Petrosian. Interesting stylistic matchup there that will open up the main card. On the undercard, Bruno Brazil obviously coming off that win over Sean O'Bannon against Loma Lukbami. That should be an interesting fight at 115. Undefeated Daniel Marcos will take on Arichalang at 135 pounds. That opens up the start of the card. Not too much else to kind of feed off of. We do have Michael Johnson versus Darius Flowers. I know you're a big fan of that fight, Harry. Also Ihar Poteria versus Robert Burshek. Sean Denny is going to kill me for butchering that name. I'm going to have to get another rating on Twitter for how badly I've done that. And that kind of wraps it up. A lot of great card. Obviously, Max Griffin versus Jeremiah Wells should be a little bit interesting on the prelims as well. But I mean, not great. But look, we got to go through these cards to get to the next one, and the next one is a big one, 298 Volkanovski Topuria. So look, we'll do our due diligence. We'll talk about these fights on the breakdown next week. To wrap up this week's severe setup, we're going to just talk about a certain topic this week. I've chosen, and I've said at the top of the podcast, obviously UFC's TV deal is coming up, and I want to change that. It's the broadcast deal, because we're gone kind of out of this era of cable TV and TV deals. We're streaming now. We're on the streaming services. You got your Netflixes, you got your Amazons, you got whatever you got. I mean, they tried to get us with the cable. We thought we were getting one over them, but they finally got us with the streaming too, Harry. It's a strange old world that we're living in right now. But we kind of got into the topic on the last Balance Breakdown, if you haven't heard it, about certain tiered systems that the UFC are working with. We've got obviously the level of card that we have at the UFC Apex this weekend. We have the fight night cards that in front of a crowd that seem to be a little bit better quality on paper, a little bit more atmosphere, a little bit bigger. We've got our standard pay-per-views like we've had in the Toronto card with John Strickland and the guy he fought, I'm forgetting his name, Jerkus Duplessis, who beat him, the middleweight champion of the world. Thank you very much. And we've got our monster cards that are coming up. That's 298, 299, 300, and whatever else comes after the way. So with those tiered systems, you kind of said, with pay-per-views, Harry, we can get a kind of certain tiered system on the pay-per-view. And I think, the UFC are creating a kind of a space in the market right now where they are stacking these pay-per-view cards, because it is the last year of their TV deal. And I think that might be beneficial to the fans, because they're going to want to stack these cards. They're going to want to draw numbers, because they're going to need those numbers to bring into the negotiation table to kind of bolster and get as much money out of the next deal, wherever it may be, whatever platform it's on. Will it be ESPN? Will it be other? Maybe that's the first question I'll ask you. Can you see the UFC re-signing with ESPN? What do you think of the overall structure of these kind of deals? Now, we've seen recently the WWE has signed in to Netflix for the Raw program. It could be a thing where we see the UFC maybe, we'll give you the Apex fights, we'll give you the other fight night cards, and obviously we'll give ESPN the pay-per-view model. They could spread themselves out and get numerous deals here. The overall landscape, what you can remember from the last deal, it was almost 7 years ago since they signed up with ESPN. Big excitement around that deal. The UFC has grown and grown and grown, and it's this juggernaut, and they're in a pretty good state of affairs coming into this next negotiation. Harry, how do you kind of see it all playing out?
Well, I think that one thing that is of certain is the UFC are very, very, very happy with a TV deal that takes as much of the pressure off them to sell and market pay-per-views as possible. Right? One of the really, 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 really solid and beautiful things for the UFC about the ESPN deal is that for every pay-per-view, the ESPN paid them as if they had gotten, I think it's 250,000 pay-per-view sales or whatever, some number, right? I'm not amazing on that. Now, if that is the case, right, and they can replicate that exact thing, then that is absolute A1 perfect stance for the UFC, because they can continue on as they had for the last 7 years, and they can still do everything that we've got with the bumper deals and the bumper cards here and the real highlight fights, but the grading system that we've talked about. If somebody comes in and says, well, we want this and we want that, but actually we're not going to pay you a set figure for your pay-per-view portion. Instead, we're going to take a cut of whatever it is, and we're going to do this, and the finances are going to be different. Well, then that makes life slightly more difficult for the UFC, and we're going to go back to a model where the UFC is going to be looking at its stars, and it's going to be saying, look, lads, we need you to do a little bit more of that heavy lifting. We're going to see certain fighters be elevated into sort of star status, I think, and it will the necessity for stars will become more prevalent. Now, of course, that isn't to say that the UFC don't want to sell pay-per-views, because obviously anything over that they make is just pure profit for them, and that's great. That's fantastic. However, the UFC, I think, and maybe this is a harsh thing to say, but the UFC in the last little while have gotten very comfortable. Maybe even I'd use the word lazy in some of the ways that they have marketed cards, marketed fights, marketed fighters. And it's felt as though there is maybe a slight bit of nervousness surrounding this next couple of months/year when it comes to negotiation. Now, as you say, they're in an extremely strong position. They are by far and away the out and out leader in mixed martial arts promotion. However, there's a lot of competition out there when it comes to live sports, when it comes to general streaming, we said TV deals. We said we wouldn't say it, but we've said it. General TV deals, and the rate with which people are looking at streaming content from what it was sort of 3 years ago is different. I think people are realizing that streaming deals are becoming just as diverse and therefore just as expensive as maybe your regular cable or the other providers that you were looking at. And so I do think there's an element with which that's going to come into play. What do I think will happen? Well, I think the UFC are going to sign an absolutely megalithic deal once again. And I suspect they will do that in exactly the same vein as they did this time, whether it be with ESPN, whether it be with an Amazon, whether it be with a Netflix, whether it be with a Hulu or whoever it is that's going to trump up the right money with the right terms. I can't see them struggling for a TV deal. I can't see them having to shop around too hard. But, you know, the UFC, this will be my last point. The UFC are kind of backing themselves into a interesting corner when it comes to things like the Bud Light stuff, when it comes to some of the words that Dana White has said about the Peloton sponsor and, you know, this and that and the next thing, where he's sort of painting himself into a position where he is appealing to a certain demographic, right?
Yeah, 100%.
And certain brands and certain advertisers may look less favorably on that.
Absolutely, but I definitely think you're right in saying that there's going to be a lot of competition for here. The last deal that they did sign spanned for 7 years. The deal gave UFC approximately $300 million per year over a 7-year period, which equals somewhere in around 1.52 billion, whatever you want to call it. A lot of money is on the table there. I think there's going to be a lot of potential buyers. I think that that's going to be good for the UFC because, you know, they'll be able to kind of bid against one another and raise what money that they do get overall. The relationship that they have with ESPN and how successfully the UFC are doing it, because look at the quality of the fights, as we always have talked about, Harry, has kind of gone down and dwindled a little bit inside the UFC, but the UFC has never been bigger than it is right now. It's selling out arenas without any main events, without any kind of announcements. The fans are chomping at the bit to get to these live events. How big of a part do you think ESPN has played in the success of UFC over the last 7 years?
Massive, for sure. ESPN, still one of the global leaders in sports entertainment, still one of the biggest platforms and channels that are available. And so I think the UFC, there's also, I don't want to make this like a let's slag on Dana White podcast, but I think there is something for Dana White that is very enticing about matching a brand like the UFC with a brand like ESPN. There's something gratifying about that. There's something glorifying about that. There's something that would feel like that's a legitimate brand to be partnered with when it comes to your platform. Whereas if you, let's say Amazon come in for lots and lots and lots of money, but then ESPN comes somewhere close, I would suspect he would go with ESPN, right? Because it's sports entertainment, because of the name and the history and all these things. But we cannot, without a shadow of a doubt, we cannot downplay how dramatic having the name ESPN next to or written underneath your product impacts the way that people view your product, right? And I think, to your point, the UFC has never been bigger. And some of it is because before, when it was on Fight Pass or it was on Fox or it was on whatever, those are big names to be dealing with. But the UFC was generically split across a number of different providers. And, you know, on ESPN, you've got football, you've got basketball, you've got hockey, you've got whatever. And so when you are then scheduled alongside all of those really very historic, legitimate sports, people will view you in a similar light. And that's something new for MMA.
It definitely is, and it's part of the reason why I think they'll probably re-sign with the ESPN, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now, you've got the likes of Netflix and the Amazons who are trying to get into the live sports, because live sports is the only kind of thing that is viewed right now. That's where the money is at. But I think for the points that you made, being in a line with all of the other sports on ESPN, the exponential growth that they've had over the last 7 years as well, I'm struggling right now. And look at, I'm struggling to think, because, you know, Ari Emanuel probably knows exactly what's going to happen. What's bigger than ESPN right now? I don't know what is it. Netflix, maybe. Amazon, maybe. But we don't know. You don't know. Are you taking a risk by going onto that platform? Because we've seen the growth of the UFC. We've seen how much the partnership with ESPN has helped them. And to me, I feel that they're going to probably use other platforms to up the bargaining tool for ESPN to get in bed with UFC for a number of years. You mentioned some of the mishaps, some of the, you know, thoughts, opinions of Dana White and other UFC fighters, and the trouble that that brings might deter some of the big execs at ESPN. But I think at the end of the day, money talks. And, you know, we're at a stage right now where they can kind of, you know, you're at a stage where the CEO of a company can slap his wife in the face on video and completely get away with it. So I can't, I don't know. I shudder to say it can't really get any worse than this, but it probably can, Harry. But it'll be interesting. Gun to your head, who does the UFC sign up with, in your opinion?
ESPN.
Yeah, I think so. It's a pretty simple question. It's a pretty simple answer for me. I think if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that's where we will leave it today for the Severe Setup. I hope you enjoyed what you heard. If you did, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, give Harry a follow, BJJ_Harry Powell at IO'Neill MMA. We'll chat to you the next time.